Alara stood in the office that had once been her father's, a place that had always smelled of pine resin, title charts, and the faint, metallic tang of brass shavings. Now it smelled only of her uncle's dry pomade and the finality of paper. Her Uncle Martin did not look at her. He aligned a stack of ledgers on the polished surface of the desk, his knuckles white. He was a man who found comfort in straight lines and closed accounts. "The shipyard is sold," he said, his voice as flat as a new plank. "The house along with it. The buyers have been generous. They take possession at the end of the week." Ilara said nothing. She did not cry. She did not plead. Grief was a private, heavy thing, a tool she had carried since her father's sudden passing 2 months prior. He had been a shipwright, a master of his craft, a man who could read the soul of a piece of timber with a single touch. He had taught her everything. He had taught her that strength was not in volume, but in structure. That integrity was in the joinery, the unseen parts that held everything together against the storm. "There is no place for you in the new arrangement," Martin continued, finally daring a glance at her. His eyes were pale, administrative. "You understand. It's business." She understood. She was a loose end, a line item to be cleared. To Martin, she was just her father's strange daughter, a young woman of 28 who preferred the scent of sawdust to perfume, the heft of an adze to fine china. He had never understood why her father, a man of such standing, had spent years teaching his only child the laborious, dirty work of the yard. He had never seen the fortress of love and competence her father had been building within her. "I've prepared a final settlement," he said, pushing a thin envelope across the desk. It slid to a stop near her hand. It was an insulting pittance, enough to last a month, perhaps 2 if she was frugal. It was the price of her entire world. She picked it up. The paper felt brittle, insignificant. Her gaze drifted past her uncle to the wall where her father's tools had once hung in a precise, reverent order. They were gone now, sold off as part of the yard's assets, all except one. On a small hook by the door, forgotten in the inventory, hung her father's primary plumb bob. It was not ornate, but it was perfect. A solid brass weight, heavy and dense, tapering to a needle-sharp point, suspended from a braided linen cord. It was a tool for finding true vertical, for establishing a line of absolute truth against which all else was measured. Her father had called it his conscience. She walked to the door, her boots making no sound on the familiar floorboards. She lifted the plumb bob from its hook. The brass was cool and substantial in her palm, a solid piece of a world that had otherwise turned to vapor. It was the only thing she wanted. "I'll be gone by morning," she said to the back of her uncle's head. He simply nodded, already turning his attention to a new set of figures. The departure was a quiet affair. Before dawn, with the salt mist still clinging to the sleeping harbor, Alara shouldered a single canvas satchel. Inside, she had packed a change of clothes, a small block of hard cheese, a loaf of bread, her father's whetstone, and a few essential hand tools she had managed to secret away. A chisel, a small dovetail saw, a marking knife. Curled in the bottom, wrapped in an oilcloth, was the brass plumb bob. She did not look back at the house or the looming, silent cranes of the shipyard. To look back was to invite a weakness she could not afford. She turned her face to the north and began to walk, following the jagged line where the land met the sea. For 3 days she walked. The landscape grew wilder, the coastline more severe. The neat, managed harbors gave way to stony beaches and cliffs that fell sheer into the churning gray water. The air grew colder, cleaner, scented with kelp and distant, unseen pine forests. She was a solitary figure in a vast, indifferent painting. The physical act of walking was a balm. It was methodical, rhythmic. Left foot, right foot. The crunch of gravel, the sigh of the wind, the ceaseless roar of the surf. It was a rhythm that silenced the screaming emptiness inside her. On the evening of the 3rd day, She crested a rise and saw a small village huddled in a rocky cove below. It was a place called Port Fallow, a name that spoke of lean times and forgotten histories. A handful of salt-bleached houses, a single pier, and a tavern whose windows glowed with a weak, yellow light. She had less than half of her uncle's insulting settlement left. She needed a place to rest, to think. Inside the tavern, the air was thick with the smell of stale ale, wood smoke, and damp wool. A few weathered fishermen sat at a table, their voices a low grumble. Alara took a seat in a dark corner, ordering a bowl of stew from the weary-eyed publican. It was while she was nursing the warm bowl that she overheard the conversation that would change her life. "Heard they're sellin' the Bellringer's Folly," one of the fishermen said, a man with a face like a sea chart of wrinkles. "For the back taxes, is it?" Another chuckled. "Who in their right mind would buy that pile of stones? Cursed it is." "Aye," the first man agreed. "Still rings, they say. Once a year on the solstice, right at midnight. One single solemn toll. No one's been up in that belfry in 50 years. Alara's attention sharpened. She leaned forward slightly, catching the publican's eye. He ambled over, wiping the counter with a damp rag. "What is this Bellringer's Folly?" she asked, her voice quiet. He shrugged. "Old church, out on the point. Deconsecrated a century ago. Some say a mad captain built it, a man who lost his mind to the sea. They say his ghost still haunts the place, ringing that bell for a ship that never comes home. It's a ruin. The roof is gone. The sea's eating at the foundation. The town's been trying to get rid of it for years." "For sale?" she pressed. "Aye. Clerk's office will have the deed. Be happy to see the back of it, I reckon. Cost you more to tear it down than it's worth." A strange, defiant idea began to form in Alara's mind. A ruin. A place no one wanted. A place with a history and a mystery. It felt right. It felt like a reflection of her own state, abandoned, weathered, but with a story still clinging to its bones. The next morning, she went to the town clerk's office. It was a small, dusty room at the back of the general store. The clerk was a thin, peevish man with ink stains on his fingers, who looked at her worn clothes and solitary presence with unconcealed disdain. "I'm here about the old church on the point," she said. He blinked, then a smirk touched his lips. "The Folly? You're not serious." "How much?" she asked, ignoring his tone. He named a price. It was a paltry sum, the exact amount she had left in the world. He was practically giving it away, confident that the burden of the property was worth more than the land it sat on. "I'll take it," she said, pulling the last of her folded notes from her satchel. The clerk's smirk widened into a grin of disbelief. He drew up the papers with a flourish, as if participating in a grand joke. He watched her sign her name, Alara Vance, on the deed. As he handed her the document, a brittle, yellowed piece of paper, he laughed. "Well, miss, enjoy your new cathedral. Just don't expect any miracles." She took the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it in her satchel. She did not need miracles. She had her hands, her father's lessons, and a solid brass plumb bob. For now, that would have to be enough. The walk to the point took the better part of an hour. The path dwindled from a cart track to a mere suggestion in the tough coastal grass. The wind was a constant, physical presence, pushing against her, whispering secrets she couldn't yet understand. And then she saw it. The clerk had not exaggerated. It was a ruin. Perched on the very edge of the headland, it looked less like a building and more like a natural rock formation, carved by the relentless wind and sea. It was made of massive, dark stones, slick with green algae on the seaward side. The great slate roof had almost entirely collapsed into the nave, leaving the inner walls exposed to the sky like a ribcage. The arched windows were vacant eyes, staring out at the endless gray horizon. It was desolate. It was magnificent. For a long moment, a wave of despair, cold and sharp as the sea spray, washed over her. The sheer scale of the dereliction was overwhelming. The clerk's mocking laughter echoed in her ears. What had she done? She had traded the last of her money for a pile of rubble and a ghost story. She closed her eyes, her hand tightening on the strap of her satchel, feeling the reassuring weight of the tools within. She remembered her father's voice, calm and steady as he worked a difficult piece of wood. "Don't look at the whole project, Ellie. It'll scare you. Just look at the next cut, the next joint, the next task. Do that one thing right, then the next." She opened her eyes. The next task. Shelter. She began a slow, methodical circuit of the building. The main nave was a disaster zone of fallen timbers, shattered slates, and a century of accumulated debris. But on the leeward side, tucked behind the main structure, was a smaller appended room, the sacristy. Its roof, made of heavy stone slabs, was mostly intact, and its walls were solid. One of the small lancet windows was boarded up, the other shattered, but the door, though hanging from a single corroded hinge, was still there. It would do. She spent the rest of the day making the sacristy habitable. She heaved the heavy door back into place, securing it with a wedge of stone. She swept out the thick layer of dust, bird droppings, and dead leaves with a makeshift broom fashioned from a fallen branch. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. She found a small stone hearth in one corner, choked with rubble, and cleared it. By nightfall, she had a small, sputtering fire going, its flickering light pushing back the immense darkness. She ate the last of her cheese, wrapped herself in her thin blanket, and fell into an exhausted sleep on the cold stone floor, the sound of the wind and the sea her only lullaby. The next days fell into a routine born of necessity. Her first priority was securing her shelter. She needed to repair the sacristy roof before the autumn rains came in earnest. This meant venturing into the treacherous nave to salvage usable slate and timber. It was dangerous work. The remaining roof trusses groaned under their own weight, and the floor was a minefield of rotten wood and sharp debris. But her father had taught her to read structural stress, to see the lines of force in a leaning wall or a sagging beam. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, testing every foothold before putting her weight on it. It was during one of these salvage operations that her attention was drawn upward to the belfry. It was a square, graceless tower, but it stood defiant, the most intact part of the entire structure. The bell, a dark bronze giant, was visible against the sky, green with verdigris. The story of the single, annual toll echoed in her mind. Curiosity, a feeling she had not had the luxury to indulge in weeks, stirred within her. The stone staircase to the tower was slick with damp, but solid. She climbed, her footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. The belfry was a windy, open chamber, offering a breathtaking, dizzying view of the sea crashing against the rocks far below. The bell hung in its massive oak frame. It was immense, easily a ton of cast bronze, its lip thick and rounded. The great wooden wheel for the bell pull was still attached, but the main rope, the one that should have dropped to the nave for the ringers, was gone, rotted away decades ago. But there was another rope. It was not the thick, hand-over-hand pulling rope she expected. This one was thinner, more like a ship's hawser, dark and stiff with age and salt. It was attached directly to the bell's clapper, the heavy metal tongue that struck the bell to make it ring. And it did not hang down. Instead, it ran from the clapper, through a simple iron pulley bolted to the oak frame, and then went straight down into a hole that had been deliberately drilled through the thick stone floor of the belfry. Alara knelt, her fingers tracing the edge of the perfectly round hole. This was not the work of decay. This was intentional. This was engineering. She peered into the darkness. The rope descended straight down, a black line disappearing into the heart of the church. This was the anomaly, a bell that could not be rung from the nave, connected to a rope that ran into the very stones of the building. The fisherman's story was not just a ghost tale. It was a mechanical puzzle, a thrill, sharp and clear, cut through the fog of her exhaustion and grief. This was a problem to be solved, a piece of craftsmanship to be understood. It was a language she knew. She went back down the winding stairs, her mind racing. She had to follow the rope. Her father had taught her to trace a problem to its source. She returned to the nave, her eyes now scanning the walls and ceiling not for salvageable timber, but for the path of that mysterious line. She found it. A similar hole was drilled through the vaulted stone ceiling of the nave, and another in the floor, offset by several feet. The rope was gone in the open space, likely rotted long ago, but the path was clear. It descended through the church's main level and into the crypt below. The entrance to the crypt was a heavy stone slab in the floor of the chancel, the space before the altar. It took all her strength, using a salvaged timber as a lever, but she managed to shift it, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into absolute blackness. The air that rose to meet her was cold and ancient, smelling of damp earth and utter stillness. Lighting a makeshift torch from a resinous piece of pine, she descended. The crypt was not large, a low-ceilinged space filled with empty burial niches carved into the walls, and there, in the ceiling above her, was the rope. It emerged from the floor of the nave, threaded through a series of rusted iron pulleys bolted to the stone, and ran horizontally across the length of the crypt, before disappearing into the far wall. She followed it, holding her torch high. The wall where the rope ended was different. The rest of the crypt was rough-hewn, functional, but this section was made of carefully dressed stone, the mortar lines finer, the fit more precise. It looked like a later addition, or a section that had been rebuilt. The rope passed through a small hole in one of the central blocks and was gone. She ran her hand over the cold stones. It felt solid. She pushed, she pulled, she looked for a seam. Nothing. Frustrated, she stood back, her mind working. This was a dead end. But the builder, this mad captain, had been an engineer. There had to be a logic to it. Then she remembered her father's plumb bob. She fetched it from her satchel in the sacristy. Returning to the crypt, she held the brass weight up, letting it hang from its braided cord. In the flickering torchlight, she held the line of the cord against the vertical mortar joints of the suspicious wall. Most were true, but one, near the floor, was off by a fraction of a degree. It was almost imperceptible, a flaw so minor no one would ever notice it. Unless they were looking for a flaw, unless they were a craftsman checking another's work. She knelt, examining the stone at the bottom of that subtly incorrect line. It looked like all the others, but when she pressed on its lower edge, it moved. There was a low grinding sound, and the stone tilted inward, revealing itself to be the disguised end of a long lever. With a deep groan of stone on stone, a section of the wall, a perfect rectangle about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, swung inward into darkness. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She held her torch into the opening. It was a small, dry chamber, no bigger than a closet, cut from the living rock of the headland. The air was perfectly still, devoid of the dampness of the crypt. On a simple stone shelf carved from the wall sat 2 objects, a large, iron-bound sea chest and a thick, leather-bound logbook. She set her torch in a wall sconce and approached the chest. It was locked with a heavy iron padlock, green with age. She had no key, but she had a hammer and a chisel. It was brutal work, the sharp clang of steel on iron echoing in the tiny space. But after 10 minutes of determined effort, the lock shackle broke. With a groan of protest, she lifted the heavy lid. She gasped. The torchlight glittered on a sea of gold. The chest was filled to the brim with gold coins. Not a pirate's hoard of mismatched doubloons, but neatly stacked columns of sovereigns and eagles, the currency of nations. It was a fortune, a life-altering, staggering fortune. For a long time she could only stare, her mind unable to process the reality of it. It was too much, too sudden. Her hand trembled as she reached in and picked up a single coin. It was heavy, real. This was not a dream. Finally, she turned her attention to the logbook. She sat on the floor of the hidden chamber, the open chest of gold glowing beside her, and opened the book. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the ink faded but perfectly legible. The first page read, "The log of Captain Elias Thorne, his final account." She began to read. Thorne had been a master mariner and a brilliant, self-taught engineer in the mid-19th century. He had designed and built his own ship, the North Star, a vessel faster and more seaworthy than any of its time. He had a wife and a young daughter, and a lucrative trading business with partners who, he wrote, had smiles of brothers and hearts of sharks. The betrayal was swift and total. On a voyage home, his partners sabotaged the cargo manifests, framing him for smuggling. They seized his ship, his fortune, his home. His wife, heartbroken and destitute, fell ill and died. His daughter, sent to a cruel orphanage, followed soon after. Thorne, left with nothing but the clothes on his back and a warrant for his arrest, vanished. He came here, to this desolate point of land, a place he had known from his sailing days. Consumed by a grief so vast it bordered on madness, he began to build. Using a small inheritance his wife had hidden away, he bought the point and began construction of the church, a monument to his lost faith and his lost family. It was his fortress and his penance. He quarried the stone himself, raised the walls, and designed the structure with the same obsessive precision he had given his ship. And he built the bell. The final pages of the log detailed its creation. Deep in the sea caves beneath the church, accessible only at low tide, he had constructed an ingenious and massive water clock. A tidal pool, fed by a specific channel, would fill with the turning of the tides. Over the course of a year, the slow, patient drip of water from this pool filled a massive stone basin. When the basin reached a precise weight on the winter solstice, the anniversary of the day he received news of his daughter's death, it would trip a complex series of levers and counterweights, pulling the rope and causing the bell to toll. One single, mournful ring. A salute to his lost fleet of two. Ilara felt tears welling in her eyes. This man, this stranger from a century past, was a kindred spirit. He had been betrayed, cast out, and had turned his grief and his skill into a fortress of stone and a work of staggering, heartbreaking genius. His solitude echoed her own. The final entry was dated 20 years after he began his work. His hand was shakier, but the words were clear. "I am old now. The work is done. My yearly vigil is all that remains. If you are reading this, then you have found my secret. You have done so not by chance, but by thought and observation. You have seen the flaw in the stone, the logic in the rope. You are, perhaps, a craftsman, a builder, one who understands such things. This place, this gold, it is a burden to a ghost. I leave it to you. Let it not be a monument to sorrow, but the foundation of a new life. Repair these walls. Make this place a home, a beacon. Find peace here, as I have, in the work of your hands. It is my final will and testament. May it serve you better than my first." Ilara closed the book, her tears falling onto the worn leather cover. They were tears not of sadness, but of profound, aching gratitude. She was not alone. A stranger, long dead, had reached across a century to give her a map, a fortune, and a purpose. She was no longer just a survivor. She was an heir. The discovery of Thorne's legacy lit a fire in her. The gold provided the means, but the logbook provided the mission. She would not just survive here, she would build. She would honor the spirit of the man who had seen a fortress where others saw a ruin. The work began in earnest. Her first purchase, made by walking back to the next town south and arranging for a wagon delivery, was not for luxuries, but for materials and better tools. Wagon loads of seasoned oak timbers, bundles of new slate, barrels of lime for mortar, and a full set of professional-grade woodworking and masonry tools. She started with the sacristy, her small shelter. She stripped the old stone roof, repaired the timber supports beneath with perfectly cut scarf joints, and laid a new waterproof membrane before resetting the heavy slabs, chinking them with fresh, strong mortar. She glazed the window, rebuilt the hearth, and sanded the stone floor until it was smooth. It became her command center, a clean, dry, warm space from which to launch her assault on the rest of the ruin. Then she turned her attention to the nave. The task was monumental. She built a heavy-duty scaffold, her shipwright's knowledge of rigging and load-bearing structures serving her well. Piece by piece, she began clearing the collapsed roof, carefully salvaging every usable piece of the ancient king-post trusses. The wood was old-growth oak, hard as iron, and she treated each piece with the reverence it deserved. Her solitary, relentless labor did not go unnoticed. The village of Port Fallow had watched her purchase the folly with amusement. Now they watched with a growing sense of bewilderment. The sight of a lone woman, high on a scaffold, expertly wielding an adze to shape a massive new beam or wrestling slates into place, became a local curiosity. The first to approach was Silas, the town blacksmith. He was a mountain of a man with a beard full of soot and arms like anchor chains. He came out to the point one afternoon, ostensibly to gawk, but she saw the professional interest in his eyes as he studied her joinery. He watched her for an hour, silent, as she sharpened a chisel on her father's whetstone, the stone singing as she worked the steel to a razor edge. "You've a good hand for that," he grunted, his voice a low rumble. "My father taught me," she said, not stopping her work. "He taught you well," Silas said. He pointed with his chin toward the iron strap she was using to reinforce a joint. "Those are salvaged, rusted through. They won't hold against a winter gale." "They're all I have," she replied. He chewed on this for a moment. "I've got a forge and scrap iron. You need proper fittings, braces, straps, bolts." He paused. "My winch for hauling boats is seized. The gearing is complex. I can't make sense of it." Alara finally looked at him, understanding the offer. It was not charity. It was a trade. Competence for competence. "I can look at it," she said. The next day she went to his forge. While he heated and hammered out new, heavy-gauge iron fittings for her roof, she disassembled the winch. It was a beautiful piece of old machinery, but clogged with rust and grime. She cleaned it piece by piece, calibrated the gears using her plumb bob to check their alignment, and reassembled it. By the end of the day, the winch worked more smoothly than it had in years. Silas, without another word, loaded a full set of custom-forged ironwork into her cart. It was the beginning of a friendship, built not on words, but on the solid foundation of mutual respect. Her next ally was Maeve, the woman who ran the general store. Maeve was the village's quiet matriarch, a woman who saw everything and spoke little. She had watched Alara's weekly supply runs, noting the practicality of her purchases, the lack of frivolity. She saw the calluses on Alara's hands and the quiet determination in her eyes. One day, as Alara was paying for her goods, Maeve added a small sack to her order. "What's this?" Alara asked. "Seedlings, for a garden. You'll need vegetables come winter," Maeve said simply. "There's a patch of good soil on the south side of the church. Gets the most sun." She looked Alara in the eye. "A person needs roots, one way or another." It was an offering of sustenance, a gesture of faith in her future. The town clerk who had mocked her sale saw her now, directing wagons of prime lumber and speaking with Silas the blacksmith as an equal. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of baffled resentment. His dismissal had turned to dust in the face of her steady, undeniable progress. He was a man who dealt in paper value. He could not comprehend the wealth of skill and resilience. An old fisherman named Finn, who claimed to be the last person in Port Fallow who had actually spoken to someone who knew Captain Thorne, began visiting. He would sit on a low stone wall, mending his nets, and tell her stories, filling in the gaps in the logbook. He told her how Thorn had been seen as a madman, but a harmless one, a hermit king in his castle of stone. Finn's stories gave a human face to the ghost, grounding the legend in the soil of the place she now called home. By late autumn, the church was transformed. The roof of the nave was complete, a magnificent structure of oak and slate, a testament to both Thorn's original design and Alara's faithful restoration. The gaping windows were framed and ready for glass, which she planned to install in the spring. The interior was cleared, the stone floors swept clean. It was no longer a ruin. It was a great hall, a shelter, a home. The test came sooner than she expected. An unseasonable storm, born in the deep Arctic, swept down the coast with terrifying speed and violence. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind rose from a moan to a demonic shriek. The sea, once a distant roar, became a ravenous beast, throwing waves against the cliffs that exploded into spray hundreds of feet in the air. Alara secured her home. She barred the heavy oak door she had built, wedged shutters into the empty window frames, and stoked the fire in the sacristy hearth. The church stood firm. The new roof held, the timbers groaning but not yielding. The walls, built by a man who knew the sea's fury, shed the wind like water. She felt a deep sense of security, a partnership with the long-dead captain. As night fell, the storm intensified. Through a crack in a shutter, she saw a flicker of light out on the water, the harbor light, the town's only beacon. And then it was gone. The lamp had been smashed or extinguished. A cold dread filled her. She knew Port Fallow's small fishing fleet had gone out that morning, expecting a calm day. They would be trying to make it home now, blind in the tempest. An idea, born of desperation and legacy, seized her. Thorn had built this place as a monument. She would make it a beacon. Working quickly, she dragged dry timber into the center of the nave's great stone floor. She built a massive bonfire, a pyre of hope against the storm. The flames leaped high, their light a brilliant, dancing orange that filled the vast space. She unbarred the shutters on the landward windows, letting the light pour out into the screaming darkness. But it wasn't enough. They needed sound, a guidepost in the chaos. She raced up the winding stairs to the belfry. The wind hit her with the force of a physical blow, threatening to tear her from the stones. She fought her way to the bell. The mechanism Thorn had built was for a single, yearly toll. It was of no use now, but the great wheel for a manual pull was still there. She had to ring it herself. She had no proper rope. Thinking fast, she uncoiled a long length of heavy hawser she had stored for lifting beams. She clambered onto the massive oak frame, the wind trying to rip her away, and frantically worked to attach the rope to the bell's wheel. Her fingers were numb with cold, but she worked with the focused desperation of a sailor in a gale. Finally, it was done. She wrapped the end of the rope around her hands and pulled. The bell, a ton of silent bronze, resisted. She put her entire body into it, her feet braced against the frame. It moved, tilting slowly. She pulled again, harder, and the clapper swung, striking the inside of the bell with a deafening, resonant clang. The sound was immense, a physical shockwave that vibrated through her bones, cutting through the howl of the wind. She let the rope go and pulled again, and again. She found a rhythm, a desperate, powerful tolling that rolled out over the sea. Clang, clang, clang. A lighthouse of sound. For over an hour she stayed there, a tiny, defiant figure in the heart of the storm, ringing the bell. Her muscles screamed, her hands were raw, but she did not stop. She was ringing for the fisherman. She was ringing for Captain Thorn. She was ringing for her father and for the quiet, resilient core he had built inside her. Then, through the gloom, she saw it. A faint light, then another, rounding the point not toward the treacherous harbor entrance, but toward the sheltered cove just below the church, a place only locals knew. The boats were using her light, her sound, to guide them to safety. One by one, the small lights found sanctuary. They were safe. Exhausted, she let the rope fall silent. The storm began to abate as dawn approached. When she finally descended, she found the nave filled with people. The fishermen and their families, their own homes damaged or flooded, had seen the light and come to the only safe harbor on the coast. They were huddled around the remains of her bonfire, wrapped in blankets, their faces etched with exhaustion and a quiet, profound gratitude. Silas was there, and Maeve, who handed her a steaming mug of tea without a word, her eyes saying everything. They looked at her, then at the magnificent, solid roof above them, and they understood. She had not just saved them tonight. She had built the ark that saved them. Months passed. Spring arrived, painting the headland with wildflowers. The church was complete. The windows were glazed, filling the nave with a clear, clean light. It was not a place of worship, but it had become the heart of the community, a place for meetings, for feasts, for shelter. It was her home. One quiet evening, Alara sat at the heavy workbench she had built in a side chapel. The air smelled of beeswax and lemon oil. The setting sun streamed through a western window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. In her hands, she polished her father's brass plumb bob, its surface now gleaming, its weight a familiar comfort. It represented the truth she had inherited from him, the integrity of a straight line, the value of quiet competence. Next to it on the workbench sat a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. She had found it tucked in a corner of Captain Thorne's sea chest, a secret piece of whittling, a memento, perhaps, of his lost daughter. It represented the legacy she had earned, the purpose found in solitude, the beauty that could be built from grief. The two objects, one from the man who gave her the skills, and one from the man who gave her the place to use them, sat together in perfect harmony. She looked around the great hall, at the soaring timbers, the solid stone walls, the peaceful light. She had come here with nothing but a satchel of tools and a broken heart. She had bought a ruin, a ghost story, a joke. But her father had not bequeathed her money or property. He had given her his hands, his eyes, his patience. That was her true inheritance. It was the key that had unlocked the second inheritance, the one left by a kindred spirit a century before her. A profound sense of peace settled over her, as solid and as deep as the foundations of the church itself. She had found her place, not by birthright or by accident, but by the steady, methodical work of her own two hands. The small, insulting sum her uncle had given her, the money she had used to buy this pile of worthless, cursed stones, had been the best money she ever spent.